Necrospective. The vain quarrel over Heidegger has no philosophical significance of its own. It is merely symptomatic of a weakness of present-day thought, which, being unable to find any new impetus, returns obsessionally to its reference points. And now, as the end of the century approaches, painfully relives its primal scene, which dates from the century's early years. In a more general way, the fuss over Heidegger is symptomatic of the collective revival mania that has overtaken our society as the time for passing the last 100 years in review draws near. There is thus a revival of interest in fascism, in Nazism, in the extermination. And here too there is a temptation to reopen the file on the historical primal scene, to whitewash the dead, to put the balance straight. At the same time, however, there is a perverse fascination with returning to the source of the violence, a collective hallucinatory vision of the historical truth of evil. Our imaginative powers must indeed be in a feeble state at the moment. Our indifference towards our own situation and our own thinking must indeed be immense, for us to be resorting to such regressive thaumaturgics. Heidegger is accused of having been a Nazi. In point of fact, it barely matters whether the aim is to indict him or defend him on this charge. Both sides fall into the same trap. Both sides are guilty of a low form of thought, a thought so debilitated that it no longer has either confidence in its own antecedents or the force to transcend them, while what little vision it retains is squandered in impeachment, complaint, self-justification, and historical verification. Scrutinizing the ambiguities of its masters, even toppling them from their pedestals as master thinkers, philosophy is in a strictly defensive posture. The same goes for our society as a whole, which, having failed to generate a new history, is doomed to chew over the old one in order to prove its own existence, including the existence of its past crimes. But what does a proof amount to? It is really only because we have disappeared politically and historically today, and therein lies our problem, that we seek to prove that we died between 1940 and 1945 at Auschwitz or in Hiroshima, which at least makes for a strong history. We are like the Armenians who wear themselves out trying to prove that they were massacred in 1917, a proof that is unattainable, useless, yet in some sense vital. It is because philosophy too has disappeared today, and therein lies its problem, for how can something live if it has disappeared? That it seeks to demonstrate that it was definitively compromised along with Heidegger, or rendered aphasic by Auschwitz. All of this reflects a desperate historical search for a posthumous truth, a posthumous absolution, and it comes at a moment when there is, precisely, insufficient truth available to ensure the verification of anything, when there is, precisely, no longer enough philosophy to underpin any relationship between theory and practice, and when there is, precisely, no longer enough history to back up any historical proof of what happened. We forget a little too easily that the whole of our reality is filtered through the media, including tragic events of the past. This means that it is too late to verify and understand those events historically, for the characteristic thing about the present period, the present fin de siècle, is the fact that the tools required for such intelligibility have been lost. History should have been understood while history still existed. Heidegger should have been denounced or defended while it was still possible to do so. A prosecution can be mounted only if a sequential continuum exists between the supposed crime and the trial. But we have now been transplanted elsewhere, and it is simply too late, as the television program Holocaust and even the film Shoah clearly demonstrated. These things were not understood while we still had the means to understand them. Now, they never will be. They never will be because such basic notions as responsibility, objective causes, or the meaning of history, or lack thereof, have disappeared, or are in the process of disappearing. The moral or social conscience is now a phenomenon entirely governed by the media, and the therapeutic zeal applied to its resuscitation is itself an index of how little wind it has left. We shall never know now whether Nazism, the concentration camps, or Hiroshima were intelligible or not. We are no longer part of the same mental universe. Victim and executioner are interchangeable. Responsibility is diffrangible, dissoluble. Such are the virtues of our marvelous interface. We no longer have the strength that forgetting gives. Our amnesia is an amnesia of the image. Since everyone is guilty, who will declare an amnesty? As for autopsy, no one believes any longer in the anatomical accuracy of the facts. We have only models to work on. Even supposing the facts lay shining bright before our eyes, they would still not have the power to prove or convince. Consider how continual scrutiny of Nazism, of the gas chambers and so on, has merely rendered them less and less comprehensible, so that it has eventually become logical to ask an incredible question. But, in the last reckoning, did all those things really exist? The question is perhaps an intolerable one, but the interesting thing here is what it is that makes it logically possible. And in fact, what makes it possible is the media's way of replacing any event, any idea, any history, with any other, with the result that the more we scrutinize the facts, the more carefully we study details with a view to identifying causes, the greater is the tendency for them to cease to exist, and to cease to have existed. Confusion over the identity of things is thus a function of our very attempts to substantiate them, to fix them in memory. This indifference of memory, this indifference to history, is proportional to our efforts to achieve historical objectivity. One day we shall be asking ourselves whether Heidegger himself ever existed. The paradox of Robert Faurison's thesis may seem repugnant, and indeed it is repugnant in its historical claim that the gas chambers never existed, but at the same time it is a perfect reflection of a whole culture. Here is the dead end of a fin de siècle so mesmerized by the horror of the century's origins that forgetting is an impossibility for it, and the only way out is denial. So proof is useless, since there is no longer any historical discourse in which to frame the case for the prosecution, but punishment too is, in any case, an impossibility. Auschwitz and the final solution simply cannot be expiated. Punishment and crime have no common measure here, and the unrealistic character of the punishment ensures the unreality of the facts. What we are currently experiencing is something else entirely. What is actually occurring, collectively, confusedly, via all the trials and debates, is a transition from the historical stage to a mythical stage. The mythic and media-led reconstruction of all these events. And in a sense, this mythic conversion is the only possible way not to exculpate us morally, but to absolve us in fantasy from the guilt of this primal crime. But in order for this to be achieved, in order for even a crime to become a myth, the historical reality must first be eradicated. Otherwise, since all these things, fascism, the camps, the extermination, have been and remain historically unresolvable for us, we should be obliged to repeat them forever like a primal scene. It is not nostalgia for fascism that is dangerous. What is dangerous, albeit pitiful, is that pathological reenactment of the past in which everyone plays a part, in which everyone effectively collaborates, those who deny the existence of the gas chambers just as much as those who believe in their reality, Heidegger's detractors just as much as his defenders. What is dangerous is the mass delusion whereby all the wealth of imagination missing from our time, all the capital of violence and reality, now become illusory, is transplanted back to that time by a sort of compulsion to relive it, by a sort of deep-seated guilt over not having been there. All this bespeaks a desperate process of abreaction in response to the fact that these events are on the point of escaping us on the level of reality. The Heidegger affair, the Klaus Barbie trial, and so on, are just so many feeble, convulsive reactions to this loss of reality, which is now our reality. Faurison's claims are a cynical transposition of this loss of reality into the past. The statement, "it never existed," means simply that we ourselves no longer exist sufficiently even to sustain a memory, and that hallucinations are the only way we have left to feel alive. Postscript. In view of this, perhaps we ought simply to dispense with our present fin de siècle. I would suggest that the 1990s be abolished in advance, and that we go directly from 1989 to 2000. After all, the fin de siècle has already arrived, complete with its necrocultural pathos, its endless commemorations and mummifications. Is there any good reason why we should have to languish for another decade in this hellish atmosphere? Rectification! Hip hip hooray! History is risen from the dead. The great event of the end of the century is underway. Everybody is suddenly breathing free at the idea that history, momentarily smothered under the weight of totalitarian ideology, has resumed its course with renewed vigor following the lifting of the blockade around the countries of Eastern Europe. The field of history has supposedly at last been reopened to the unpredictable interplay of peoples and their thirst for freedom. In contrast to the depressive mythology of past fin de siècle, the end of the 20th century is now supposed to inaugurate a dazzling remobilization of the final process, a rebirth of hope, and a return to play of all possibilities. On closer inspection, however, the event in question turns out to be rather more mysterious, rather more of an unidentified historical object. The thawing out of the countries of the East is, without doubt, an extraordinary turn of events. But what exactly happens to freedom when it is defrosted? Such an operation must be a hazardous one, its outcome uncertain, quite apart from the fact that you are not supposed to refreeze what you have once defrosted. The USSR and the Eastern Bloc constituted not just a deep freeze for freedom, but also a laboratory, an experimental environment in which freedom was isolated and subjected to very high pressures. The West, on the other hand, is merely a museum, or more accurately, a dump, for freedom and the rights of man. If deep freezing was the distinctive and negative mark of the Eastern universe, the ultra-fluidity of our Western universe is even more disreputable, because thanks to the liberation and liberalization of our mores and beliefs, the problem of freedom can simply no longer be posed. Rather, it is virtually resolved. In the West, freedom, the idea of freedom, has died its fine death. All the recent commemorations have clearly shown that the idea of freedom is gone. In the East, it has been murdered, but there is no such thing as the perfect crime. From an experimental standpoint, it will be most interesting to see what freedom is like when it resurfaces, resuscitated after being stripped of all its signs. We should then get a sense of what such reanimation and post-mortem rehabilitation can do. Freedom defrosted may not, after all, be so fair to look upon. And what if we find that it seeks nothing so much as to barter itself away in a fervent embrace of automobiles and kitchen appliances, even of mind-bending drugs and pornography? That is, to exchange itself immediately for Western liquid assets, to pass from the end of history by means of freezing to the end of history by means of ultra-fluidity, by means of circulation. Because the fascinating thing about the events in the East is certainly not that they may be seen as placidly coming to the aid of ailing democracy and supplying it with fresh energy, not to say fresh markets. What is far more fascinating is to observe the telescoping of two specific scenarios of the end of history. The scenario whereby it is frozen solid, as in the concentration camps, and the scenario according to which it comes to an end thanks to a total centrifugal expansion of communication. Both cases embody a final solution. And it is not impossible that the thawing out of human rights in the East may be the socialist equivalent to the depressurizing of the West, a simple dissipation into the Western void of the energies bottled up in the East for the last half-century. The fervor accompanying these events may be deceptive. If it expresses nothing more than the zeal with which the countries of the East are casting aside the bonds of ideology, or if it is a mimetic fervor, a tribute, as it were, to those liberal countries where all liberty has already been traded in for a technically easy life, then we shall have found out definitively what freedom is worth, and that it is probably never to be discovered a second time. History offers no second helpings. On the other hand, it could be that the present thaw in the East may be as disastrous in the long term as the excess of carbon dioxide in the upper atmosphere, that it may bring about a political greenhouse effect, and so overheat human relations on the planet that the melting of the communist ice sheet will cause western seaboards to be submerged. Odd that we should be in such absolute fear of the melting of the polar ice, and look upon it as a climatic catastrophe, while we aspire, with every democratic bone in our bodies, to the occurrence of just such an event on the political plane. If in the old days the USSR had released its gold reserves onto the world market, that market would have been completely destabilized. Today, by putting back into circulation their vast accumulated store of freedom, the Eastern countries could quite easily destabilize that very fragile balance of Western values which strives to ensure that freedom no longer emerges as action, but only as a virtual and consensual form of interaction, no longer as a drama, but merely as the universal psychodrama of liberalism. A sudden infusion of freedom as a real currency, as violent and active transcendence, as idea, would be in every way catastrophic for our present air-conditioned redistribution of values. Yet this is precisely what we are asking of the East. Freedom, the image of freedom, in exchange for the material signs of freedom. This is an absolutely diabolical contract, by virtue of which one signatory is in danger of losing their soul, and the other of losing their creature comforts. But perhaps, who knows, this may, after all, be the best thing for both sides. Those societies that were formerly masked, communist societies, have been unmasked. What is their face like? As for us, we dropped the mask long ago and have for a long time been without either mask or face. We are also without memory. We have reached the point of searching the water for signs of a memory that has left no traces, hoping against hope that something might remain when even the water's molecular memory has faded away. So it goes for our freedom. We would be hard put to it to produce a single sign of it, and we have been reduced to postulating its infinitesimal, intangible, undetectable existence in a programmatic, operational environment, so highly dilute that in truth only a spectre of freedom floats there still, in a memory every bit as evanescent as waters. The fountainhead of freedom in the West has run so dry, witness the commemoration of the French Revolution, that we can but put all our hopes in the East reserves, as newly discovered and opened up. But once this store of freedom has been liberated, the idea of liberty having indeed become as scarce as a natural resource, what can be expected to happen except, as in any marketplace, the release of an intense but superficial energy generated by exchange, followed by a rapid collapse of differential energies and of prices? What is the meaning of glasnost? A transparently clear reverse run through all the signs of modernity, but in speeded up motion and at second hand. A postmodern remake, almost, of our original version of modernity. Furthermore, positive and negative signs are mixed up together here so that human rights emerge side by side with crimes, catastrophes, and accidents, all of which have taken an enthusiastic statistical leap in the USSR since the regime was liberalized. The country has even rediscovered pornography and extraterrestrials, hitherto censored but now celebrating their reappearance along with everything else. This is what lends the present global thaw its experimental aspect. We see that crimes and catastrophes, be they nuclear or natural, everything, in fact, that has been repressed, are all part and parcel of human rights. Religion too, naturally, along with fashion in the broadest possible sense. And all this is a fine lesson in democracy. For everything that we are, all the supposedly universal signs of the human, we now observe resurgent in the East in the form of a kind of ideal hallucination, a kind of return of the repressed, embracing the worst, the most trivial, and the most worn-out features of Western culture, which from now on knows no frontiers. The present conjuncture is thus a moment of truth for this culture, as was its earlier confrontation with the primitive cultures of the entire world, a confrontation from which the West can scarcely be said to have emerged with flying colors. Such is the irony of fate that it is we who are going to be obliged perhaps one day to save the historical memory of Stalinism once the Eastern countries have forgotten all about it. In that case, it will be up to us to put the memory of the dictator into cold storage, just as he once did to the movement of history itself. After all, the Stalinist Big Freeze is also part of our universal heritage. There is another sense, too, in which these events are extraordinary. Those who adopt a self-righteous hostility to the idea of the end of history would do well to consider the turn history is now taking, as witness these current developments, not only towards its end, which remains part of the fantasy of a linear history, but at the same time in the direction of its systemic reversal and elimination. We are in the process of wiping out the whole of the 20th century. We are wiping out all signs of the Cold War one by one, perhaps even all signs of World War II, and those of all the century's political and ideological revolutions. The reunification of Germany and many other things are inevitable, not in the sense of a leap forward of history, but in the sense of a reverse rewriting of the whole of the 20th century, a rewriting that will surely take up a great deal of the century's last decade. At our present rate, we should soon be back to the Holy Roman Germanic Empire. Here, perhaps, is the illumination we may expect for the present fin de siècle, and the true meaning of the much-debated phrase, the end of history. The fact is that we are busy, in accordance with an oddly enthusiastic mourning process, smoothing out the salient events of the century, whitewashing the century, as though all that had occurred therein, revolutions, partitions of the globe, extermination, the violent transnationalism of states, or nuclear cliffhanging, in short, history itself in its modern stage, amounted to nothing but an imbroglio with no exit, and as though everyone had now begun to unmake this history with an ardor equal in every way to that applied earlier to its making. Restoration, regression, rehabilitation, the revival of the old frontiers, differences, specificities, and religious beliefs, and everywhere, even on the level of social mores, the change of heart. Apparently, all the marks of liberation won over the last century are now fading, and perhaps they are all destined to disappear altogether, one after the other. We are in the midst of an immense process of revisionism, but not in an ideological sense. History itself is what we are revising, and we seem anxious to finish the job before the end of the century. Do we perhaps nurture the secret hope that with the coming of the new millennium, we might be able to start all over again with a clean slate? That somehow we can restore everything to its original state? But when exactly did that state exist? Before the 20th century? Before the French Revolution? How far can this process of reabsorption and smoothing out take us? It can certainly occur very, very quickly. Witness the events in the East. This is precisely because there is no construction involved, but rather a massive deconstruction of history, which has assumed almost viral and epidemic proportions. Maybe, after all, the year 2000 will never occur, as I speculated long ago, for the simple reason that the curve of history will have become so accentuated as to create a reverse trajectory, with the result that that temporal horizon will never be attained. History would, in that case, turn out to have been an asymptote, an infinite curved line tending towards its own end, yet never reaching that end, and at the last moment veering off from it in the opposite direction.